And on today's show, why policy expenses should be separated from policy performance. Part 3 of this week's series on product due diligence with nationally recognized product due diligence expert Barry Flagg, CFP, CLU, and CHFC. Hi everyone, I'm Steve Savant, syndicated financial columnist and contributing author to Backroom Technician in Innsbruck. Let's get down to business. Well, welcome to the show, Barry.
Thanks.
Day 3, I want to talk, we're going to get into it today. We are now going down the holy grail of where Barry lives, and he invented this mantra that all of a sudden is making waves in the industry and changing some of the thinking of a lot of the people that have been in what I would call the due diligence arena way back from the Townsend and Shook days and the early days of Executive Life and Mutual Benefit and First Capital and other troubled carriers. I want to talk about this idea about why you make such a big deal, and you do, between separating this is policy expenses and this is policy performance, and when we're analyzing it, never the two shall meet. Talk about why is this so important?
You're giving me too much credit. I absolutely positively didn't invent it, but I absolutely positively do believe that separating them out as a requirement, not just as a matter of belief, but because that's what Prudent Investor Principles has said for the last century. If you are marketing, if your audience is marketing to fiduciaries, Section 7 of the Prudent Investor Act says you must consider expenses separate from performance, which is dealt with in Section 2 of the Uniform Prudent Investors Act. FINRA says that you need to separate the two. So there's plenty of guidance out there that says that considering expenses separate from performance is the prudent thing to do. I mean, to change expenses, I have to go refile with 51 whatever state departments of insurance, right? So expenses are stable. Expenses are static. Performance, though, as we know, performance is whatever it is.
Now, when you say that, I just want to make a clarification here. I mean, there's a big difference between current company practice on their expenses and what the contractual guarantees are. So there's a disparity there, and that's different. And they could change it, so that could move this way. But performance also has its own issues, separate aside. So, okay, let's just do expenses first. I have all the expenses, and the largest expense, of course, is cost of insurance.
Absolutely.
Which, by the way, from an income point of view, I can actually mitigate some of that if I'm willing to give the best possible return by lowering my expense loads as low as I can.
Correct.
And still be TAMR compliant.
Correct.
All right, I have my expenses now, and I'm going to look at that only. I'm going to then do this mean average that your software, Veralytics, actually does. You're going to go through that whole issue. Remember, we haven't talked about performance on this. We're just doing the expense loads.
Correct.
Now we have done all that. It's done. Now we know what that is. Now, are we going to a history platform on performance then? What are we measuring on the performance side of that equation?
In a Veralytic report?
Yeah.
Two things. It depends on product type. If it's a general account product, a traditional product, then cash values for all general account products, all traditional products, have to be invested, as a practical matter, in high-grade bonds and government-backed mortgages, predominantly in high-grade bonds and government-backed mortgages. So we are measuring the performance of the general account against both historical performance for those asset classes and then also peer group alternatives or other carriers' general accounts. If it's variable, the Veralytic system can't possibly know what the asset allocation is for the client, can't know what the fund selection is. It might have been easier when there was one growth fund, one bond fund, and one money market, but now there's hundreds of funds inside these families. So what Veralytic measures there is how many options do we have, how many good performers do we have among those options, and what are the expenses of that overall family. So two different things for two different products.
Okay, so if I'm doing a measurement on cost of insurance, which is a major issue here, we are going to find out there are companies that are off, they're a standard deviation. They're off the bell curve.
Correct.
So those are the companies that you could weed out pretty fast if you're looking at, when I look at a regular contract and I say I want to do the best due diligence I can, I'm not looking for bottom line numbers because anybody can put a current company assumption on the performance on it. So if I went to zero, I'm asking, if I went to zero, would I be able to quantify a current assumption UL or an index UL as two examples? I'm just going to go to zero and look at that as a boilerplate. That's my first due diligence, expenses only. Is that a way to do that?
You're saying assume zero performance in the illustration and then just compare
expense loads at the current assumption practice of the carrier.
That could be a proxy.
Okay.
Sure, that could be a proxy.
Now that gets me in the game. Now I want to go back to your thinking of, okay, I've done most agents can do that. We can request an illustration level. But what we can't do is get the mean average, see what the industry is. I'm trying to compare it against their peers to see, is there really, do I really have a top of the line contract?
Right.
That's the thing that I'm wanting to get to, because what if I compared 3 carriers and they weren't even in the top on the averages on your software? So that to me is becoming the new next step to due diligence.
Yeah, and go back to what we were talking about earlier. There are these 10,000 pricing combinations and permutations. So when you say, a carrier has good pricing, and I'll make another analogy to the investment business. Fidelity Investments is a good investment company. Vanguard is a good investment company. Not every one of their funds is rated 5-star by Morningstar. By far, right? There are some funds that are good, and there are some same thing with insurance companies. There are some products or some pricing cells that they excel at, and there are some that not. So it's not as simple as saying, well, this carrier's got good pricing categorically for every one of the client situations I may encounter. You've got to measure. And then I do think that the fine-tuning that you just mentioned is an easy way to fine-tune the selection of, okay, once I'm in the ballpark, where do I go to? Where do I make my final selection? Once I get down to 3 or 4, where do I make a final selection? I think, and we talked about that last time.
We come back from the break. We're going to continue this because this is a major mantra, not only of Barry, but I think the industry is kind of catching fire on this, on the issues of separating policy expenses from policy performance. We'll be right back, right after the break. Back in the day, life insurance professionals were called field underwriters. Then, carriers trained their field force in the basics of life insurance underwriting. Today, the insurance industry doesn't educate the agent population as they once did. But now you can have the Informed Risk Guide at your fingertips so you can illustrate a reasonable rate class for your life insurance prospects. Just request your copy of the Informed Risk Guide at downtobusiness.ashbrokerage.com. It's free from Ash Brokerage, the practice enhancement company. Well, welcome back to our second segment, of course, with Barry Flagg. He's talking about due diligence. He's been an expert in this field for a long time. And I still want to remind everyone that Barry's a top-of-the-table producer. We're not just talking about analytics, but he actually knows how to sell. And part of his sales is the mantra that we're in today. Interestingly enough, fiduciaries, trust officers, these are the people that make calls, the CFOs that are going to write the checks. They really actually like, especially in some of the terms that you framed, the separation of expenses, because even if they don't know anything about life insurance, they know that about expenses. They've kind of already had a tutelage through funds, mutual funds, ETFs, and things of this nature. Talk a little bit about why this is such a good marketing idea to separate this out so you can get in front of the people who really matter.
When I first came in, transitioned from the investment business to the insurance business, it seemed to me counterintuitive to try to teach the people that I'm trying to sell how to speak the way I talk, how to speak life insurance, instead of speaking their language. I mean, if I can go to a foreign country and I can speak their language, then I can talk to everybody. If I go to a foreign country and I make them speak my language, then my market's very narrow. So I think there's a tremendous marketing opportunity in talking about life insurance the way CPAs, tax attorneys, trust officers, all talk about every asset on their clients' balance sheets, every asset in their financial plans, every asset in their estate plans in their terms rather than these terms. And those terms are prudent investor oriented, and they're defined as, we talk about expenses. How good are my expenses? Well, we talked before about the boundary. So I'm 38%, I'm 2% away from the 40% boundary. Any CPA, tax attorney, trust officer, or CFO, would understand that without having to get into a spreadsheet of 10 columns and hypothetical illustrations.
Okay, so this is kind of a new idea, because we're really doing something here that we know that the business community at large has already adopted. They're working. This is a working operational way of thinking. Nobody's, this is good. So if we can kind of change it, this is not going to take a lot for us to move down this line. Now, what you're doing, though, is you're taking it to another level. I said, well, we're comparing proposals. Okay, that's great. But now we're looking at comparing the mean average of the carriers that are all in. Now we have a bigger piece of the pie to say, against peer groups, how does this work? I think in high competitive indemnification and income scenarios, this is a huge way to separate your practice out of the pack. Nobody's talking like this, Barry. I know you find this fascinating because you're in this every day and you're so involved in it. But in everyday due diligence, if we're just looking at spreadsheets for ranking premiums, and we're looking at a few ratings from AM Best and S&P, we call it a day. We're way past that in this regard.
Absolutely.
And you have been using, this is what I want to come to this area here, is because most people that are analytic like yourself, generally, as a rule, are not really high producers. But you are a high, top of the table producer for years, right? A couple decades.
Couple decades.
You are using this to get in front of people who matter, and then you're getting referrals all based on this thinking of separating, if I want to make sure I get this right, separating policy expenses from policy performance. That, to me, is a huge issue. You've made a whole career on this. So how can I now hand that off to my advisors who are watching our show and say, this is where I want you to go?
So I was raised in this kind of client's best interest fiduciary environment. I'm not suggesting for a moment that all of your listeners need to be, all of your audience need to be fiduciaries. Far from it. But the most sought after clients typically surround themselves with CPA, tax attorneys, trust officers who are all fiduciaries. They're either statutory fiduciaries if they're a trustee, or they're code of ethics fiduciaries as an attorney or a CPA. So they are required to do what's in the best interest of the client. So you're right, I did not go the traditional sales route. I approached this, well, if I can get on their side of the table, if I can talk about life insurance the way they're used to talking about it, expenses, performance, and there's more to it than just expenses and performance. Those are the kind of the big things that Veralytic measures. Veralytic actually measures 5 things, but there's even more to it than that. These best practices for life insurance stewardship provide this framework of how to get onto the advisor side of the table, to be one of them in representing the client. And you are right. I did not go the traditional sales route, but I got into very high sales situations much quicker than most people my age at the time, simply because I was speaking. I went to a foreign country. I went to their side of the table, and I spoke their language rather than finding somebody who would be willing to speak mine.
I think this is a new way. People are always asking me, Steve, I want to take my practice to the next level. I want to go up the next level of affluent clients. But affluent clients, as you pointed out, all have these fiduciaries and people that really we need to talk like they talk. Adopting their semantics could be huge for our practice. Well, that's all the time we have for today's show. Remember, before moving forward with any of the ideas you hear on our show, always consult your tax advisor, legal counsel, or your broker-dealer compliance officer. Missed an episode? Just hop out to our site, downtobusiness.ashbrokerage.com. And remember, you could be wiser as an Ash Brokerage advisor. I'm Steve Savant. We'll see you tomorrow.